Well, it's great to see you each here this morning. I'm coming from Minnesota, where I'm guessing it's about 5 degrees above zero, and anybody can walk on water. Don't even have to know Jesus. You can walk on water. It's really not that special up there. Well, it's great to be here with you. I have a wife here somewhere. I don't know where she is. She might be with the kids because she was in the early service. And I have my daughter with me, so those of you who saw this beautiful 25-year-old woman know I could not attract that. That's my little girl. Even though I like to think I'm above average pretty, that's my daughter, and she's in Phoenix right now, and it's great to have her with us. I want to talk about something this morning that is a challenge for each of us. I'm sure it's a challenge for you. I know it's a challenge for me. And that's the issue of contentment in our lives. It's a spiritual virtue that is almost unattainable if you live in America. Philippians writes about this. He says, I've become more convinced than ever that God finds ways to communicate with those who truly seek Him, especially when we lower the volume of the surrounding static. I remember reading the account of a spiritual seeker who interrupted a busy life to spend a few days in a monastery. The monk was showing this visitor to sort of his tiny little room or cell, and the monk said to him, I hope your stay here is a blessed one. If you need anything, let me know, and we'll teach you how to live without it. Yeah, not what usually we want to hear. You need anything, let me know. We'll teach you how to live without it. That's not the American way. But I love that comment because we all want contentment. It sounds like a good thing to want. We know it's the right thing because the Bible talks about it, but we don't know very well how to get there. In his best-selling book, Into Thin Air, John Krakauer tells the story of an ill-fated expedition to the summit of Mount Everest. This was 1996. And in the book, he mentions a member of the expedition named Yasuko Namba. Ms. Namba was a 46-year-old Japanese FedEx employee with a passion for climbing. In fact, she was an accomplished climber. She'd reached the summits of 7 of the largest mountains in the world. The only one left for her to conquer was Everest, the tallest in the world. And she desperately wanted to get to the top of Everest. That was her goal. So much so that Krakauer, who was also a member of the expedition, says that Yasuko was totally focused on the top. It's as if she was in a trance. She pushed hard, jostling her way past everyone to the front of the line. She wanted to get to the top of Everest. And later that day, she actually made it. She accomplished her goal, and she was the oldest person ever to make it to the highest point in the world. Later that afternoon, however, all the climbers there, Yasuko and a number of the others, were caught in a terrible blizzard on Everest. And as the icy winds blew, Yasuko succumbed to the exhaustion of her climb, and she froze to death. Yasuko Namba died agonizingly close in time and location to where she had gained her greatest prize. This helps explain her tragic mistake. According to Krakauer, Yasuko's fatal flaw was that she adopted the wrong goal. Her goal had been to get to the top of the mountain. What she wanted the most was to stand at the top of the world and have all of her country, all of Japan, cheer her when she did. But that's actually the wrong goal, and a frequent and sometimes fatal mistake that climbers make. The goal of climbing is not to get to the top of anything. What should the goal of climbing be? To get back down, safe and alive. And she made the mistake of adopting the wrong goal. She accomplished her goal, but against incredible odds, she made it to the top, but she poured out all her energy to get there. She didn't save enough strength to make it back down. So she failed. She achieved something few people in the world achieve, but she failed because she had the wrong goal. We have the wrong goal often in this life. I know I do. I suspect you do. I'm going to talk about a virtue in our lives that is almost impossible to attain, and yet we're commanded to get there. And God uses a variety of things to shape our lives to get us there. We shoot for, in American society, more here than anywhere else in the world, we shoot for happy. We don't shoot for contentment. Nobody gets up in the morning and says, I want to be content today. We're looking for the American dream. We're looking to get happy, and we're looking for an ideal set of circumstances that are associated with it. When I was a young man, when I was just a little younger man than I am today, When I was a younger man than the 39 which I clearly am today. When I was a younger man, I wanted what most young men want. I wanted a wife, a home, 2.5 kids, a minivan, now that'd be a crossover, and a dog. And I wanted to be able to go fishing and hunting and all of those wonderful things. That was sort of the dream for me. And we sort of assume if we can get to happy, if we can accomplish these goals, reach these things in life, many of them material, if we can get there, that contentment is going to naturally follow. And in fact, the opposite is actually true. When we're aiming for happy, it's like aiming for the top of Everest. We might get there, but we often won't get down to the bottom. We won't accomplish contentment. In fact, in the late 80s and early 90s, there were several studies, hundreds of studies about happiness that were published each year. And by 2014, there were over 10,000 studies a year on happiness. It was an exciting shift for psychology, one that the public immediately responded to. Media outlets clamored to cover the new research. Entrepreneurs began to monetize it, try to make money off the happiness industry. There were startup companies, programming apps to make ordinary people implement the field's findings. That was followed by a bunch of celebrities and personal coaches, motivational speakers, probably guys like Tony Robbins, all eager to share the gospel of happiness. According to Psychology Today, in the year 2000, the number of books published about happiness was 50 books a year. 8 years later, 4,000 books published on happiness. People have been interested in the pursuit of happiness, but all that attention has made an impact. In fact, the interest in happiness by Google searches and everything, it's just tripled and continues to grow. But there's a major problem with it. In this happiness frenzy, it fails to deliver on its promise. In fact, they say that as the happiness industry grows, we as a society are proving to be more miserable than ever. And social scientists have uncovered this sad irony that chasing happiness actually makes you unhappy. We've got the wrong goal. Bill Hybels talks about this. When you look at American society, we always think of greener pastures. Maybe greener pastures is the wrong word to use out here. I don't know what it is. I'm not used to all the brown. And so this is a little bit of a shock here. So I had to go to a golf course yesterday and just walk around a little bit. But Bill Hybels says, we always think if we just had a better job, a nicer house, a newer car, we'd be happy. And that sort of is the American dream. Keep moving up the ladder. But according to this logic, shouldn't Americans be the happiest people on the planet? I mean, look at our state of living in this culture. We should be some of the happiest people on earth. We enjoy greater wealth per capita than most countries. We have more opportunities for education, for medical care, for home ownership, for car ownership, food availability, freedom, everything. Yet by a 2012 Gallup poll, we are the 33rd happiest people on the planet. 33rd on the happiness scale. Having more hasn't made us happier. In fact, do you know who the happiest people on the planet tend to be? So they go to these third and fourth world countries, and they test out much higher. You go to war-torn Guatemala, civil wars, all kinds of problems just south of us here. They're some of the happiest people on the planet. You go to Panama, those Panamanians, I think that's the right word, Panamanians, have some of the lowest GDP or gross domestic product on the planet. They're 90th, which means they are poor, very poor. They're 5th, I believe, or 7th in the world, 7th in the world in happiness. They're happy. Their country's a mess. They're happy. You go to Singapore. I have a son-in-law who was raised in Singapore. His parents were missionaries. His father still teaches in a seminary over there. His name is Josh. Josh was raised in Singapore. They're about 6th in the world, I believe, 5th, 6th, or 7th in GDP on the planet. It's a very wealthy Asian country. They are the unhappiest people in the world. Next time you see a Singaporean, you'll just see it. They're just not happy. You can tell them that. This problem shows up everywhere. We're not finding what we're looking for in life. Lydia Sad did a study. And it's a study of sort of how people believe the grass is greener on the other side of the fence. And they interviewed people in every state. So they surveyed, I think it was about 50 people in every state in the union. What they found that in some states, over half of them wish they lived in another state. But in general, about 33% of the people across the country want to live in another state. They just want to get somewhere else. They think the grass is greener. But you know how many people are actually planning on moving? Almost none of them. We just want to be unhappy and complain about where we live, but nobody actually has the courage to do anything about it. Do you know who's happy at the end of an Olympics? Who do you think would be happy? These young people go through all sorts of torturous training methodologies to perfect their bodies, to get in a position to win some sort of an event, whether it's running or swimming or diving. When they're in high school and all their friends are having pizza parties, they go there and they're not eating all the pizza. They're not drinking all the pop. These people have no lives at all. A lot of them are, and I'm not saying this about homeschooling, but a lot of them are homeschooled or tutored because they don't even have time for school. So homeschooling is not like an educational choice that the parents are making for their kids because of education. It's because they've got to be training. These kids have no life, and often many of them have been training since they were 4, 5, 6 years of age, and they get to the Olympics, and their goal is the gold medal. And at the end of the day, the happiest person at the Olympics is the person who wins the gold medal. They stand on the medal stand. They're hearing their national anthem. They are the happiest person. Who do you think the second happiest person is? It's not the silver medalist. They're not happy at all. They're like the Singaporeans. No, they're not happy. Do you know what the silver medalist is thinking? I almost had it. I almost had it, and I will regret this for the rest of my life. They're on the medal stand. They're second place in the world, and they are very unhappy because they missed their dream. You know how the bronze medalist is very happy. You know what they're thinking? Man, I'm just glad to be on the stand. I'm just glad to be here. You know, I wanted the gold, obviously, but I'm just glad that I'm here. I'm on the stand, and there's pictures being taken of me. I'll have this medal forever. We have a hard time with contentment. Joe Queenan writes for the New York Times and GQ. Not sure what that says about him. But he criticizes what he calls our culture's inability to accept the ordinary. We expect that every experience be a watershed, every meal extraordinary, every friendship epical, every concert superb, every sunset meta-celestial. Nothing can ever again be exactly what it was in the first place, which is ordinary. Most of our existence is ordinary. Most of who we are is ordinary. We might have some unique gifts that make us a little above average in most areas, or in some areas, you know, but the reality is most of life is an ordinary experience. And we can't be content with that. We carry this into our relationships. We don't look for marriage anymore. We're not looking for a partner to spend our lives with. We're looking for a soulmate. And ladies, I hate to tell you about the 50% of the population that isn't you. Good luck finding one. Because we're not made for that. And we have to learn it slowly over time, but we expect so much in our relationships. Intimacy expectations are higher. Sexual expectations in marriage are higher. Happiness expectations are higher. We expect other people in our lives to somehow give us something that they really can't even give us. And the problem is we are all ordinary with extraordinary expectations in life. And our culture breeds this. And there's a multi-billion-dollar advertising industry that you'll be watching during the Super Bowl today that's trying to help you to be unhappy with your life as it is right now, so that you'll go out and make some major change and buy what they offer so that you can somehow attain it. Speaking of the Super Bowl, I realize that the Philadelphia Eagles fans have thrown snowballs at Santa Claus. I get that. But you can't root for the Patriots. They're just cheaters, and they're Spygate and all of this stuff. You just can't. And I see the uniform back there. It's okay. It's all right. It's all right. All right. All right. That's all right. Tom Brady has enough jewelry. All right. We're going to look at a passage about this in Exodus chapter 15. Exodus chapter 15. If you have a Bible, you can turn there. Now, I just want to give you a little historical context. Exodus 15 is about 3,500 years ago. So it's about 2,000 years before Jesus. The Exodus actually means to come out of. So it's a book of the Bible about when the children of Israel, God's chosen people, the seed of Abraham, we get Jesus from Israel. So the children of Israel are coming out of Egypt. They've been enslaved there for 430 years or more. They're coming out of Egypt. That's what this book is about. By the time you get to Exodus 15, they've come out of Egypt, out of slavery. They're out for about 45 to 60 days during what I'm reading here. So they're a month and a half or 2 months out of slavery where they've been for 20 generations. Exodus 15, verse 22. Then Moses led Israel, so they're wandering in the desert. It would be a place probably very similar to this part of the country where you can't, I didn't mean that in a negative way, but you just, that's not a shot. That's not a shot. It's just, you can't sustain 2.5 million people in Kingman, Arizona before the trains came through. All right? You can't do it because there's not enough food here to sustain. You can't farm this area really. That's what these children of Israel, 2.5 million of them, were wandering around in a place that could not sustain them. So they were nervous. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into this desert of Shur. For 3 days they traveled in the desert without finding water. They came to Marah, which they couldn't drink its water because it was bitter, and that's why the place was called Marah. It means bitter. So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What are we to drink?" Well, then Moses cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood, which he threw in the water, and the water became fit to drink. There the Lord issued a ruling and instruction for them and put them to the test. He said, "If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases I brought on the Egyptians." He's referring to the 10 plagues that he had brought on the Egyptians to soften their grip on Israel, to help them let them go. "For I am the Lord who heals you." Well, then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs and 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. This is the next story, just a little bit later. The whole Israelite community set out from Elim and came to the desert of Sin. So now they're moving on, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after they'd come out of Egypt. So you got 45 days from the Exodus. In the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt." 45 days, they've been in deliverance. "I wish we just died back in slavery. At least there we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. Egypt was like the Golden Corral. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." That's in the Hebrew. So then the Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. And in this way I will test them and see whether they will follow my instructions. On the 6th day, they are to prepare what they bring in, and that is to be twice as much as they gather on the other days." So the 6th day would be Friday. They're supposed to gather twice the amount because God didn't want them to gather on the Sabbath, which in Hebrew culture is Friday at 6 o'clock till Saturday at 6 o'clock. So that's the Sabbath, not supposed to work, so they gathered a double portion on Friday. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, "In the evening you'll know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. And in the morning you'll see the glory of the Lord because he's heard your grumbling against him." "Who are we that you should grumble against us?" Moses also said. "You will know that it was the Lord when he gives you meat to eat in the evening and all the bread you want in the morning because he's heard your grumbling against him. Who are we?" Now, I love what Moses points out here because this is a little bit of a spiritual lesson for all of us. You are not grumbling against us, but against the Lord. When we are dissatisfied with our provision, our place in life, and we start complaining, we're not complaining against our boss or against our coworkers or against the people around us, our spouse or friends. Discontent is an issue between us and God. And that's what Moses points out. All right, so first point, contentment is a spiritual journey destination or goal. God wants us to get there. And it's clearer when you get to the New Testament. We have a couple of verses that talk specifically about this virtue called contentment. One of them is in Timothy. 1 Timothy 6:6, "But godliness, being like Christ, with contentment, accompanied by contentment, that is great gain in this world." That's great gain. That's better than wealth in this world. If you can become Christ-like, and along with that, as it relates to material issues, you're content. That's the goal. And he makes the point, it's not about what we have in this life. For we brought nothing into the world, we can take nothing out of it. So that's the destination. You want to get to contentment. I'd be shocked if many of us are there. I'm not there. It's a tough one for me. Philippians 4:12, you understand a little bit of the process God uses. This is the Apostle Paul writing again. This time he's writing from prison. So this is one of his prison epistles or letters to churches. "I know what it is to be in need. I know what it is to have plenty. I've learned the secret of being content. It's not easy. It's a secret. It's tough. In any and every situation, he says, I've learned this as he writes from prison, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. And then you have verse 13, which is sort of the Superman verse in the New Testament that we take out of context all the time. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. You'll find, somebody's going to say that after the game on the winning team. It's Jesus who helped me catch that touchdown, and he may or may not have. But the reality is, we take this verse out of context. I can leap high mountains. I can jump across rivers because of Jesus. That verse is in the context of one of the hardest things you'll ever achieve. And it's not leaping tall mountains or walking on water. It's learning to be satisfied in life with what you have. That's going to be one of your greatest challenges, is contentment. This spiritual virtue. I have a definition here of contentment, which I think is fairly accurate. I don't say it's biblical, I think it just fits. To be free from care because of satisfaction with what is already one's own. To be free from care because of satisfaction with what is already one's own. In other words, you know what? It's good enough. It's good enough. What I have is good enough. Who I'm married to is good enough. And if my wife's in here, it's great. It's just great. It's just great. You can tell her I said that. Just great. Off the charts. Lucky to have her. The only woman who ever thought this was pretty. All right. Good enough. We're learning to be satisfied with what we have in life, with what we already have. Philippians 4 is describing the process. We learn this through life's experiences. We don't come out of the womb happy and satisfied and content. We learn contentment, and you learn contentment from the valleys. And Paul learned it from the valleys. Because he'd been in prison, because he'd been shipwrecked, because he'd been in want, because he'd been hungry, when he had food, when he had a roof over his head, when he was out of prison, those were great times. He learned to be content because of the valleys. It's the valleys that create the disposition to learn this spiritual virtue. And if life is always easy, you'll probably never learn to be content because you're always looking for happy. But hard times put us in a position to learn this virtue. So Exodus 15 through 17, where we read this passage a little bit earlier, is a key part of the Bible on this theme. There's a grumbling theme there. It's a Hebrew word, loon. To murmur is often how it's translated. Murmur, if you remember your language class in grade school, it's an onomatopoeia. Any teachers here? An onomatopoeia is a word that sounds like what it is. Murmur, murmur. It sounds like murmuring. That's what it is. They were murmuring. They were grumbling. Every occurrence of this term in the Old Testament, except for two, occurs in passages like this, Exodus 15 to 17 and Numbers 14 to 17, where God was teaching his people this issue of contentment with what they had. He was trying to break their discontent, break their murmuring. Now, the Israelites had just come out of Egypt. They'd been enslaved for 430 years, which means they were not trained for war. They also were trained for farming, and they're entering an area where there's going to be no farming. They're in the desert, and they don't have irrigation. There's no opportunity to farming. So they're in the wilderness or the desert. They're 2 to 3 million people strong. Their rations are obviously depleted after just days or weeks. Water is a scarcity, and now they're in a position to learn contentment and dependence on God. Second point, contentment is a fragile virtue connected to faith in God's provision. So we have these two different experiences. They're really back to back. They're within days or weeks of each other. They're sort of compressed here because of what God is teaching them in these couple of short pericopes in the Old Testament. The people grumbled against Moses. What are we going to drink? A little while later, they're at the next oasis and they're grumbling against Moses. What are we going to eat? I wish we could go back into slavery. In slavery, we had pots of meat. That's what they're saying. In slavery, weren't things great? Oh, yeah, they were beating us and we were building their pyramids for them, but weren't things great? How quickly we change sort of our spiritual tune towards God. But God was trying to build their faith in his provision. And once they had that, they'd be content. If we truly know that God will take care of us, which is very hard to get to for us as Americans in our culture, because we're sort of taught this rugged individualism, this pioneer spirit that expanded across the West and went from the East Coast to the West Coast, and the gold rush, and you've had some of that around here in your history, and all of these things are built on rugged individualism, and you can do it. Anybody can become anything. That creates in all of us the American spirit, which is also self-dependence, independence, not dependence on God. So we have a lot of I can do it built into us. It's sort of the fabric of our culture, and it's why we actually have a great country, but it creates a spiritual challenge for us to depend on God. It really does. But if we learn that God will take care of us, contentment is an easy next step. We're going to be less worried about tomorrow. We're going to be less worried about getting ahead. But the Israelites are so worried that they're longingly looking back on Egypt as though that was great. Slavery was great. All the food we wanted, a buffet every day. Let's go back. Now, I want to point out something that's really critical here. They're saying that. They're complaining against God within a month and a half of the greatest stories in the Bible. The stories that your little kids are learning in Sunday school throughout the year. Like the big ones. Within 45 days of when this took place, looking backward, in order to break Egypt's grip on Israel, God had allowed Moses to sort of use God's power to create, I would say, a series of 10 supernatural natural disasters. Natural disasters on steroids, orchestrated by God. And those were the Nile River turned to blood, a plague of frogs, a plague of gnats, a plague of flies, dead cattle, boils on man and beast, hail that destroyed their crops, locusts that ate what the hail didn't destroy, darkness on the land, death of the firstborn of man and beast. And as all of this is going on with God's power against the nation of Egypt, to cripple them and break them so they'll let the Israelites come out of slavery, as all of that is going on, the children of Israel are living in this special little pocket of Egypt called Goshen, somewhere I believe in the Nile Delta. And as all of this is going on, they're watching their neighbors' lives fall apart as God is punishing the Egyptians. And nothing bad is happening in the land of Goshen. They are having a spiritual lesson of how God is on their side. And they hadn't felt that way because they've been enslaved for 20 generations. But now they're seeing God is proving that he's on their side. And then after those 10 plagues, Pharaoh finally says, okay, you can go. And then they go. Pharaoh changes his mind. He's thinking, 2 to 3 million slaves was a pretty good gig for us. We didn't have to get out of bed in the morning. And so he sends his army. He leads his army after them. And 4 to 5 generations of Israelites are pinned against the Red Sea. And then Moses raises his staff, and this great wind comes from the east, and a wall of water is on one side, and a wall of water is on the other side, and there's a pillar of fire between them and the Egyptian army as God miraculously, through his presence, is separating them and protecting them. And the children of Israel, 2 to 3 million strong, walk through the sea on dry land, little kids poking their arm in the water, taking it back out, grandma trying to protect them. 5 generations. What a lesson of God's presence and provision. They got to the other side. The Egyptians thought, well, if they can do it, we can do it. And so they started crossing as well. And God then released those waters. And all of the armor that protected that Egyptian army were now weights around their shins and their chests and their chariots, and they were rooted to the bottom of that sea. And they all drowned. It destroyed an army. And the children of Israel looked back at dawn the next day, and they could see the bodies of Egyptian soldiers washed up on shore dead. God had done all of that for them. That is less than 2 months ago in their collective memory. The best stories in the Bible are less than 2 months ago, and they happened to them. Yet look at how fragile their trust in God was. That 45 to 60 days later, is God with us? Is he going to give us some water? Is he going to give us enough to eat? Because things aren't good here. We should go back to slavery. We had pots of meat there. This is so fragile in our lives, for them and for us. Contentment is built on a knowledge that God is going to take care of us, that we have what we need, that we have who we need, that it's good enough. There's no need to look beyond today with fear and anxiety, because God is going to be faithful today as he was in the the past. Hard to learn. Easy to read about, hard to live. See, we don't connect God to our jobs in America. We don't connect God to our success, our houses, our jobs, our clothes, our cars, because we're self-made. And that makes this a real spiritual challenge for us. But God doesn't want us to think that way. He wants to be seen as the provider in our lives, no matter how much you've accomplished, no matter what educational degrees you have, no matter what you own, no matter how much you prosper. God is to be viewed as the source of your success if you're a Christ follower. Doesn't mean you didn't apply yourself and work real hard and make some good decisions. But God is to be viewed as the source of your success. Third, contentment results from daily dependence and faith in God for all things. That's what he wants to create. How did he do it for them? Well, the next day, they got up in the morning and they walked outside, and Moses had predicted this, and they saw this white stuff on the ground. And in the Middle East, there is something, I think it's called coriander, so there's something that looks like manna, but this was a miracle. This wasn't just coriander seed. This was a miracle because it was on the ground, and it happened that way for the next 40 years. Every day they go out, and what they would say is, manna. So they didn't recognize it as manna. Manna means, what is it? They didn't know what it was. So they're going, manna, manna. You know, somebody pick it up, and somebody dared somebody else to taste it. First person who tasted it, yeah, I guess it's okay. And then everyone was making manna pancakes, manna biscuits, manna grits. They got tired of manna. Then they complained about that, so God had to give them some quail. Then they got sick of quail. But it was more fun gathering quail than manna because it's kind of hunting. But anyway, at least you get to kill something. So they had manna for 40 years in the wilderness. And Jesus picks up this theme in Matthew in a way you may not suspect. Give us this day our daily bread. That comes from this sort of collective memory in the wilderness in their history. And also from both a rabbinic tradition as well as a command, I believe in the Old Testament, but it certainly was a command in rabbinic law at that time, at the time of Jesus, was that people who were day laborers had to be paid by their bosses, owners, every day. So ranchers had to pay day laborers daily because nobody had enough resources to make it 2 weeks till they got their next check. So you had to pay people daily so they could go out and get their daily bread. And that's actually the way God wants us to think about him, that he's going to provide for us daily. Now, obviously, we're supposed to plan ahead, and obviously we should think that way. But our trust should be that today God will take care of me. All right, I want to close with 5 apps, and I'm in big trouble on time. So these will be called speed apps. We're going to do speed apps. God wants us to connect our lifestyle with his provision and his priorities. God doesn't want you to think of your life as though it's in your hands and you're in control of your future, and whatever you have is because of your hard work. Now, he wants you to do all those things and be all those things, but he wants you to make sure you're making a connection in your heart that he is the one who is providing for you. Give us this day our daily bread. Second, at some point, choose to self-limit material possessions. Now, I'm not going to tell you where the line is here. I'm not going to tell you at what point, at what point you're going beyond what you should as a Christian, because there really isn't a line necessarily that God has given us. And don't want to make you feel guilty about success or anything. What I am saying is, if you're going to have contentment in life, it's not going to come by bigger and better throughout life. There's a point at which there's diminishing returns there. And the studies indicate, actually, the more you try for that, the more you will be discontented. So there's a couple of brothers. They're German brothers named Karl and Theo Albrecht. And after World War II, they opened a store in a small town. It's kind of a bombed-out town in Essen, Germany. And their stores just offered the basics, like 250 items, the essentials that miners and steelworkers' families needed to survive: flour, sugar, coffee, butter, bacon, peas, condensed milk. In the 60s, this sort of took off, and these guys started this chain of stores. And you do not have one in Kingman, Arizona, but we have 2 of them in Rochester, Minnesota. And this now is an $83 billion store chain, 10,000 locations, 18 countries. It's called Aldi. And you ever been in an Aldi? Right? Aldi is an interesting store. It's like way cheaper than Walmart, believe it or not. You go into an Aldi, and there's like 4 aisles, and you're done. And the beauty of Aldi is, especially for people like me, there aren't a lot of choices. If you want potato chips, there's maybe two kinds, maybe a flavored one as well. If you want milk, there's not going to be five brands of milk. There's not going to be five brands of anything. There's simplicity. It's simple. And one of the things that makes life discontented for many of us is choices. So many choices. It's actually a problem with contentment. At some point, self-limit material possessions. I've got a daughter who kind of dropped out of the 70s right into our family. We're not sure where she came from. But she's a millennial, as all my kids are, but she's a minimalist, and that she's got like the DNA of a minimalist. She loves the whole tiny house concept and a few other things. But she's just built this way. And there's something we can learn from Danielle. Self-limiting possessions at some point. Next, well, and also they've proven by studies that money is not the key to happiness. Once you get to sort of lower middle class in American society, maybe middle class, and you've got your basic needs met, they've proven that after that, no amount of money you make will make you any happier. Studies have shown it. Now, I know you want to defy those studies and prove that they're wrong, but studies have shown it. All right, next, don't pass it on. Don't pass on discontentment. What I mean by that is this. Our kids pick up a lot of the wrong habits from us. Ron Blue tells the story. There's a father of a wealthy family. Took his son on a trip to the country to show his son how poor people can be. They spent a couple of days and nights on a farm of what would have been considered a poor family. On the return trip, the father said to his son, "Well, how was the trip?" "It was great, Dad." "Well, did you see how poor people live?" "Yeah," said the son. "What'd you learn?" "Well, I saw that we have one dog and they have four. We have a pool that reaches to the middle of the garden. They have a creek that doesn't seem to end. We have imported lanterns. They have stars. Our patio reaches to the front yard. They have the whole horizon. We have a small piece of land to live on. They have fields that go beyond sight. We buy our food. They grow it. We have walls around our property. They have friends that protect them." Father was speechless, and his son said, "Dad, thanks for showing us how poor we are." But what was Dad trying to teach his son? His view of success in life. They learn it from us. I was the last person on the planet to own a smartphone. I got a smartphone after every 5-year-old in a fourth world country had one. That's when I got one. We don't always have to have the latest and greatest. Don't pass it on. Be careful about discontentment at home. There's something that's called the Paris effect. When people go to Paris on these, it particularly affects women. They want to go to Paris where it's supposed to be so romantic. They get their husbands over there. You know what they discover? Crowded buses, cigarette butts and litter everywhere. Parisians who are really rude to Americans. And it's a mess. And people get depressed in Paris because all of their expectations are undone. They end up seeing counselors over it. We do that in our relationships and our expectations of what people can give us. Be careful about that. And finally, show gratitude. Gratitude is the discontentment antidote. They have done studies on this. And if you are a thankful person, you're likely to live longer. If you have a gratitude journal, which my wife and I just started, you're likely to live longer. If you think through what you're thankful for every day, you're going to have less risk of heart disease. Your cholesterol will be lower. By processing gratitude, it actually has health effects. It also solves this biblical virtue that we're supposed to reach for. Bob Russell, I'll close with this, said, "It's a rare person when his cup runs over that can thank God instead of complaining about the size of his mug." It's a rare person when his cup runs over that can thank God instead of complaining about the size of his mug. Are we there in this area of contentment? I'm not. But we will be happier, if you will, when we learn to be content with what we have.